Hello，大家好，歡迎大家嚟到呢個展能藝術在香港嘅網上頻道同埋資料庫嘅海外藝術家線上節目系列。我係林峰，一位作曲家同埋藝術策劃者。我哋今日好開心請嚟英國嘅著名指揮 Charles Hazelwood 同大家分享一下佢嘅樂團 Para Orchestra 嘅經驗。Welcome, Charles.
Hi.
Good to see you again.
Really good to see you too.
I think we should let the audience know a little bit of our little connection before. So back in 2008, my first BBC commission was conducted by Charles. So that was, well, for me, was a very special moment. And then the second commission also was conducted by you. So that's kind of our little connection. And through that project and through all this time that I've seen you like doing your presentation on TV and radio, I mean, I've known you as someone who is not only a conductor, but also someone who has spent a lot of energy exploring the different types of music, trying to introduce cross genres of music to different people and bringing them to concert halls and also to spaces not always, associated with music or non-classical venues for classical music and vice versa, really. So in some way, my impression of you is that you love a lot of different music and you try to, in your own way, introduce this music to different people. So, and then one of your latest projects, the Para Orchestra, is your current kind of biggest love, I guess, in your life. And so we would like to know more about this Para Orchestra project today. So would you mind giving us a little bit of introduction to your kind of experience prior to the formation of Para Orchestra, and then how everything kind of come together and this, and this Para Orchestra was formed?
Yeah, sure. I mean, first of all, to talk about the fact that you're absolutely right. I am obsessed with all kinds of music. There is no boundary line for me between the music I'm interested in and the music I'm not interested in. I feel we humans get overly fixated on categories. And the idea is that if you like this one category of music, people assume that means you won't like that other category of music, that everyone has a tribe that they belong to. Well, I believe something different. I believe there are only two types of music: great music and terrible music. And the genre is completely irrelevant. So, of course, I'm going to want to try and introduce an audience of Mozart lovers to the music of the Grateful Dead. I'd like to introduce an audience of Grateful Dead lovers to the music of Wagner. I'd like to introduce Wagner lovers to the music of Ligeti. And so it goes on. I don't see any contradiction there. And so I suppose my whole career has been about that. But in particular, it's been about doing everything I can to show that the orchestra is a thing of wonder and beauty and a thoroughly modern thing. I think people tend to think of the orchestra, and indeed most people in the orchestral sector tend to think of the orchestra as the custodian of a tradition. That it's enough in a way for it to play its Beethoven and its Brahms and its Mozart, none of which I argue with. The orchestra should be a living, breathing embodiment of that great tradition of musical history. But to me, that can never be all it is. The thing that makes the orchestra the most modern phenomenon imaginable is that it is the most perfect team in human experience. There is no other phenomenon in human experience which has such perfect teamwork on a large scale as an orchestra. Football has 11 players in its team. A symphony orchestra can have upwards of 100 players, where there is that synchronicity, that kind of parallel swimming. And yet at the same time, it has the discipline that an army platoon might have, but so much more freedom. There is freedom for every single musician on that stage to bring their color, their talent, their uniqueness to bear on any single phrase of music. And it's like if you ask an orchestral musician, what are their goals when they're coming to play with the orchestra? The best orchestral musician will say, I have two goals. The first is, how do I look good here? How do I look and sound good here? The second, of equal importance, is how do I make everyone else around me look and sound good? It's like no one is more important than anyone else, but everyone has value. That surely is the most beautiful contemporary modern quality, right? That is humanity as we currently are, or as we would wish to be. So as you can tell, I think the orchestra is quite important.
Yes. So could we just look back? And because you spent a lot of time working with different orchestras before your kind of more diverse projects. I mean, I noticed before Para Orchestra, you formed a few different bands or orchestras with synthesizers and different friends of yours, and perform quite diverse music, you know, in Glastonbury and also other venues. So could you just tell us more about how these different kind of orchestras or ensembles, I mean, why you formed them, and then how these led you to forming the Para Orchestra?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's been a constant and very dominant theme throughout my life. When I was at university, obviously I was studying music, and I was already on the way to forming a career as a conductor. It was very clear to me that conducting was absolutely what I was put on the planet to do. I discovered it one day when I was 15, quite by accident, and I never looked back. So I was at university, basically training to be a conductor. And yet my record collection had ABBA in it, and had Tomita in it, and had Ligeti in it, and had Mozart in it, and had AC/DC in it, right? I had a hugely, and I've always had a hugely wide, shall we say, Catholic taste in music. And my lecturers, my tutors used to say to me, you're never going to get taken seriously as a conductor if you don't forget all of that other repertoire, all of that other material. You must only focus on the Western classical canon. To which I said in response, by way of rebuttal, I said, yeah, but my Mozart is enhanced by the fact that I also like Terry Riley. I can't explain why, but I need both of those things in my diet. It's like having a balanced diet, not just eating meat all the time, right? You want to have a balanced diet because it's better for you, and your meat is more enhanced. You know, your experience of a steak, let's say, if you decide to eat a steak, your experience of eating that steak is so enhanced by the fact that last night you had a cauliflower, or you had some noodles, or you had some sushi. Everything feeds into everything else. Variety is the spice of life. Now, in those days, we're talking a long time ago when I was at university, it was still very much a view that you had to streamline. That if you were going to be taken seriously, you had to absolutely mono-focus on this one narrow avenue, this one direction of travel. It never made sense to me. I was like a square peg in a round hole. I was like the one person saying, no, that doesn't work for me. I need this variety. I can do, you know, even these days, I can do a Mozart gig one night with an orchestra and play a psychedelic improvisation gig the next night with a different group of people. Now, even though those are two diametrically opposed things, my Mozart will be unbelievably enhanced by the psychedelic gig I'm doing the following night. The psychedelic gig will be unbelievably enhanced by the Mozart gig I did previous night. They feed each other. So, of course, in addition to working with lots and lots of very kind of conventional symphony orchestras around the world, which I have done for 35 years, I was always seeking to create work that brought different genres together, or indeed just to immerse myself in work that involved completely different musicians from a completely different part of the kind of musical spectrum. So, for instance, I went to South Africa in 2000, and I was given the opportunity and given funding to form a brand new opera company out of rural township South Africa. So in the course of a 3-month period, I toured the length and breadth of that great musical country. I'd probably auditioned 2,000-3,000 singers in very rural township locations. I formed a company of 40 of the most jaw-droppingly talented young singer performers, who were mainly from these very rural locations. Singers, performers who'd never been in a professional choir before, so-called, or a professional ensemble, had never even acted before, but had this innate ability. Because certainly in the Black communities of South Africa, singing is endemic. It's not just something you do because you've learned how to do it, or it's a nice sort of middle-class accomplishment to sing and do nice concerts in front of your mothers and fathers and so on. Singing is a way of life. In Black South African culture, you sing about the washing up, you sing about a marriage, you sing about heartbreak, you sing about elation, you sing about just the joy of being alive. Everything is chronicled and expressed through song. So you can imagine I was very keen, very, very excited to have the opportunity to go and get something going. But of course, you're talking about musicians who've come through a very different tradition and trajectory. No one reads music. Everything is learned by ear, which is a remarkably liberating factor. You can teach a bunch of black South Africans a tune in about 5 seconds because their ears are on fire. They are so, ready. And then without anyone saying a word, they'll improvise 40-part harmony around that tune because black South Africans can just do that. London Symphony Orchestra is an amazing group, or let's say the New York Philharmonic, amazing group. They can't do that. They can't improvise 40-part harmony. They wouldn't begin to know how. So the South African group in that context are even more virtuosic. So of course, I'm interested in people who've grown up through township traditions, singing traditional Southern African music. What happens when they sing Carmen? What happens when they approach Mozart? You get a really interesting new constellation of possibility. So yeah, you're right. That has been my whole career, doing just that. I find it so satisfying.
So bringing like all these different cultures together seem to be like one of your main interests, as well as bringing together different kind of music. Actually, what you just mentioned about the contemporary music and the more traditional music, how they informed each other. I've heard very similar things from different conductors, like people who have people who have just performed a piece by John Adams or Steve Reich. They perform differently to Mozart or Beethoven afterwards, and you can really hear the difference between someone who has only been playing the same type of music, but maybe something to do with the accuracy or something to do with the manner of reading the music from again and from afresh, and so that's very interesting.
I think you're right, and of course the audience experience is so transformed if they've heard the Steve Reich piece before they hear the more sort of, as it were, a conventional classical piece. I once did a concert where I programmed Ligeti Poem and then Mahler 5. Now, Ligeti Poem, as I'm sure you know, is a piece that simply involves 100 metronomes, 100 old school wind-up metronomes, and you set them all out on a stage. They're all fully wound, and each one of them is set to a slightly different speed, from the slowest possible to the fastest possible, right? So every metronome is set at a slightly different tempo from the others. And then you basically set them all off at once, and then you listen. And the piece takes as long as it takes for all of them to run out of wind, about 45, 50 minutes. And you watch your audience, right? This is a bunch of people who turned up basically because they like Mahler. They weren't really in the game for a piece of metronome music. And they're watching it, and they're fascinated, really kind of like thrilled, a bit kind of, it feels a bit naughty to be sitting there looking at metronomes doing this. Then gradually they start to get a bit bored. They start getting a bit restless. Then they start getting angry because they've had enough now. And it's starting to become intolerable, all this click-clacking, click-clacking, click-clacking. Then they're kind of ready to explode with rage. But obviously they can't explode with rage because they're all nice middle-class people in a posh concert hall. So then they sort of retreat and kind of give up and sort of go a bit sort of still, a bit limp. It's almost like they go into a trance. And then finally the piece comes to an end and we start Mahler 5. Now you can bet your bottom dollar that audience will hear Mahler 5 in a completely different way because they've just been exposed to about 50 minutes of click-clacking, right? Actually, so there's always value. There's always value.
Actually, the most performed work of his in Hong Kong in recent years. We don't get to hear Ligeti very often in Hong Kong, but somehow this piece gets programmed a few times.
Oh my God, I can't get enough Ligeti. My girlfriend and I are a bit obsessed with him. He's just one of those composers that will always be of immense importance.
Yes, definitely. Yeah. Should we talk about your Para Orchestra?
Yes, with pleasure.
Let us know about.
Yeah, I mean,
we just talk about kind of mixing different cultures and different kind of music. And so, what brought you to that stage where you want to work with an orchestra made up of both abled, non-disabled, and abled musicians and disabled? Let me talk that.
Yeah.
Okay. So should we talk about your para orchestra? Because
Yeah.
I would like to know why at what stage do you decide, oh, I want to work with an orchestra with both disabled and non-disabled musicians, and putting them together and then kind of, put on this amazing journey together?
Thank you. Yeah, I'm always delighted to talk about para orchestra. I mean, picking up on your point from earlier, quite right. A dominant theme for me in my working life has been about opposites, or bringing in the outsider to the equation. Black South Africans singing European opera is, if you like, about an outsider coming into the room and taking on something which normally belongs to other people. I find that intrinsically stimulating, and it brings something fresh to the equation. It's like when the when the El Sistema project became really, really successful in Venezuela, and you got the Simon Bolivar Orchestra. I remember seeing them play in London. This is a bunch of people. They look a bit like young gangsters, right? They look like they've come out of a favela and they've just been shooting someone for cash. I mean, that is a stupid thing to say. And of course, they're not those people, but they've got that kind of look. They look very street. And a lot of them indeed have come from very kind of impoverished urban backgrounds. And yet they've trained up on these instruments. But they are people coming from a culture which isn't necessarily about Scriabin or Bartok, but my God, they play and you are paralyzed with excitement. It is literally the most thrilling orchestra I've probably ever heard. So again, it's about people coming from outside the equation, because they bring something which perhaps those of us that are in the middle of the equation have kind of lost, the zest, the freshness, the sparkle, the sense of possibility, the sense of there being no rules and no limits. So yeah, has been a theme for me. It's something that I find endlessly stimulating. Para orchestra was formed partly because of that wiring I have, but much more importantly because I started to think. I've got 4 kids, and my youngest kid was born with cerebral palsy. So for the first time in my life, I started thinking really seriously about disability. I'd never really thought about disability before, which is odd, isn't it? That most of us that aren't disabled don't tend to think that much about disability. I mean, it's a kind of shocking fact, surprising, and I think shocking fact that in the UK, the proportion of the population who identifies disabled is 20%. So that's an alarmingly big minority, right? And yet I, for one example, had never really thought about disability till my daughter came along and started me thinking about it. And then I thought, it's really odd that, I mean, in all these years of conducting orchestras, I never have encountered people with disabilities. They don't seem to exist in the orchestral sector. And I'm thinking, well, that's odd. You can't tell me that just because you're disabled, it means you've got no talent, no skills at music. That doesn't make any sense. So where are they? Now, the answer is, obviously, no orchestra is ableist. No orchestra is putting a sign on their door saying, if you're disabled, you're not welcome here. Obviously, that's not what happens. But the system is so negatively calibrated, really, really kind of like grassroots examples. Like there are still a great many concert halls in the UK, even now, that have a stage that's really hard to get onto if you use a wheelchair. That's a really basic, fundamental building block, right? Or a lot of disabled musicians use assistive technology to make music because, for whatever reason, their disability precludes them from playing an oboe, coranglais, a harp. But they can play a digital version of that instrument, or indeed they can play a new sounding instrument through an assisted portal, right? Now, symphony orchestras, as we well know, kind of got stuck in terms of what their ingredients are. When you think of an orchestra, you think of ranks of violas, you think of a woodwind section of 8, but usually 8 musicians. You've got flutes, you've got oboes, clarinets, bassoons, you've got some horns, you've got some brass, you've got some percussion. That's your orchestra, right? Now, to me, there's something a bit unimaginative about that. And by the way, I'm not talking about Brahms or Beethoven or Mozart. Of course, that music is perfect as it is and should be played by the orchestra that the composer required. But that doesn't have to be all an orchestra is. And more to the point, why would orchestras not have seized upon the plethora of sonic possibility that's emerged ever since electricity was invented, which is like what, at the dawn of the 20th century. So already for best part of a century and a half, the orchestra has been lagging behind the rest of the world. It hasn't continued to evolve. Now, I'm not saying that to criticize the sector. I'm saying it out of incomprehension. It makes no sense to me. But you can see that, therefore, is a fundamental barrier for any musician who has a disability and uses assisted tech to make music. There is no place for them in an orchestra. There's no opening for them in an orchestra. So these are fundamental grassroots barriers. God, I mean, in terms of assistive technology, I don't know about in Hong Kong, but in the UK, we don't have any specialists who can teach that stuff at music schools, even at conventional schools, certainly not a conservatoire. So what is an conservative musician meant to do? How do they get that conservatoire level training? Answer, they don't. It doesn't exist. There's no offer. So I thought this is all ridiculous. It's unfair that disabled people are discriminated against in the music industry. And music, by the way, is the most universal language we have as a species. So surely everything in music should ideally reflect that universality. An orchestra, as the largest embodiment of this universal art, which is music, should reflect every aspect of society. Of course it should. I mean, I always laugh to myself. If you look at a photograph of any European symphony orchestra from as little as 50, 60 years ago, how many women do you see in that orchestra? Answer, very few. Now, in 2024, it would be completely absurd to see an orchestra walk on stage that didn't have a really healthy balance of gender, of course. And now, little by little by little, God, it's slow, we're starting to see more mix of ethnicity. But in terms of disability, still like in the 5s, in the 3s, in the 2s, maybe in the 1s, maybe in the not at alls, because it's too difficult for all the reasons that I've mentioned. So I thought, okay, this is time to shine a big bright light on this issue on behalf of my daughter, on behalf of all disabled people, but on behalf of the world as a whole. Because at the moment, we miss out on talent because we aren't imaginative enough to find ways of scaffolding it, you know? That's just stupid. It's an absolute chronic waste of talent. So I was thinking these thoughts. Paralympics, you may not remember, but the Olympics and the Paralympics were in London in 2012. So I was thinking to myself, oh my God, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity when everyone in the world is going to be looking at the British community to say something about this issue, to get people thinking. So I set about forming a small but perfectly formed orchestra of professional level musicians with disabilities to have a spot at one of the ceremonies around the London Paralympics. And cut a long story short, I decided to call it Para Orchestra because my model of inspiration was Paralympics, which I don't think anyone would disagree is a phenomenal example of where disability at the end game is irrelevant. People don't watch the Paralympics predominantly because the athletes are disabled. They watch the Paralympics because it is world-class sport, right? So there has to come a point where the disability itself becomes an irrelevance because for a long time, let's call a spade, for a long time, people watched the Paralympics out of pity or out of a sense of wanting to support a worthy endeavor, thinking to themselves, isn't it wonderful that some poor wannabe disabled athletes are getting a chance to do a thing and we're all going to watch and we'll all feel good about ourselves and how wonderful for them that they had a go, right? But that can't be all it is, right? The world can't have sympathy or empathy forever. There has to be something which is like world class about the endeavor. So Paralympics has become that. I mean, it has taken over 50 years for the world to actually come into a position of trust with Paralympic sport. No one who watches Paralympics now sees it as anything other than world-class sport. It's not a thing of charity anymore. It's a thing of inspiration. So I thought, okay, that's an amazing model. Let's see if we can make much faster change happen in music. And by the way, music is much more universal than sport. People think of sport as a global phenomenon. It is. Music is much more of a global phenomenon. I don't think there is a single citizen of planet Earth who doesn't engage with music on a daily basis. So music should be at the front, not at the back of this issue. Para Orchestra was formed in its first iteration. We did play the closing ceremony. It was a hell of a launch, you know, several 100 million people watching this little orchestra on the telly. And yeah, it was great. Then there was a period of time when I didn't really know what to do next with it. I got a bit stuck. I couldn't evolve the model. Anyway, for various reasons, we relocated the orchestra, which had been based in London. We relocated it to Bristol. You know, London is an amazing place. I'd go so far as to say London is probably the musical capital of the world. There is more music going on in London than in any other city anywhere. It's an incredible place. Lucky London to have all of that plethora of musical opportunity and choice. The downside is, I suppose, if you're trying to get something new going in London, it's very hard to get oxygen because there's so much else going on. So the real kind of eureka move was to take the institution, this little nascent orchestra, base it in Bristol, which is a vibrant, colourful, energetic city in the west of England, where things were a little bit lower temperature. You know, the Bristol community they've got bandwidth, they've got the attention to really get behind a new thing that comes into town. So Barrow Orchestra has proudly and happily settled itself here. But the key thing that's happened is that, you know, I was very aware when I started the thing, I didn't want it to be a disabled only orchestra for very long at all, because I believe if you establish things which are purely disabled, you're simply creating another ghetto, creating another them and us situation. Of course, the end game for anyone with a disability and all the best people who don't have disabilities is about a mixed world, not a segregated world, right? So it's very important to me that Barrow Orchestra, as quickly as possible, became a highly evolved mixture of disabled and non-disabled musicians. And I suppose now we've really achieved that goal. The orchestra is about 80 or 90 players at full strength, and about 50 of them are disabled. So it's a new world order. It's a completely new paradigm. And again, coming back to our original theme, it's about not the clash, but the integration of people from very different ranges of experience and background, and the chemistry and the alchemy that creates or creates a possibility for is thrilling beyond belief. It's like there are no limits with this orchestra. I'm so in love with this orchestra that I've cancelled all my work with all the others. You know, I sacked my agent about 3 years ago and said goodbye to about 35 orchestras around the world that I've been working with for a very long time, because I only want to work with Barrow Orchestra now. That's how amazing it is.
Moosh is an incredible party of a show that descends on communities and walks their streets and welcomes them out of their houses to come and join in the fun.
Moosh is an act of love. It's like a giant human jukebox. It's mobile masayoke.
It's one of those shows that's so universal, and the joy of singing and dancing and being together is something that absolutely everyone can get involved with.
We are really excited that it's in our area. I mean, it's really rare that we have a gathering in this street. I've never seen that one.
People just get drawn in. It seemed to spread and attract an enormous amount of love. People want to come out to the street, have a laugh, have a bop, have a sing.
This is amazing.
The lovely thing about Smoosh is that it can mould itself into any kind of environment. There's virtually nowhere it can't play. It can genuinely capture hearts and minds wherever it goes.
I think it's very moving that you kind of took your kind of personal family association and then thought about this much bigger and important issue, and then just try to act on it. And I think it's very loving to learn about that. And I also really like the fact that you mentioned you kind of took the Paralympics as the inspiration, as you know, they're sports of excellence, not just like a community kind of projects or anything. I really love the fact that you want to showcase these musicians, the integration of them as, you know, as the most excellent cultural activity, as you know, as you can create, not just another kind of communities project. And I think that it's, I guess that's the essence of Para Orchestra.
Yes, it is. I mean, you put your finger on it. The thing that I cannot stress highly enough, and indeed, whenever we have a lead artist coming in from the outside to collaborate with us, I find very gratifyingly that they get on board with this immediately. They can see this immediately. You know, the anxiety would be when you hear about an orchestra that's got a large proportion of disabled musicians. There's always an anxiety that somehow it will be tokenistic, that it will be about creating an opportunity for people who, for whatever reason, perhaps don't quite have the skill set, can't actually quite cut it, but because they are different, they're getting kind of fast-tracked. It's so important to stress, Para Orchestra is only successful because every musician in it is world-class, regardless of whether they have a disability or they don't have a disability. And in fact, when people come to watch their gigs, I don't think they're even aware, they're not even thinking who's disabled on that platform, who isn't disabled, because of course, anyway, a lot of disabilities are invisible. The disability has to become irrelevant. It has to be about the art, only about the art. Unfortunately, there are, certainly in the UK, a number of initiatives that certain orchestras have been doing where they've developed a kind of disabled wing. They've developed a protocol or a model, which means that they decide to hire a certain number of disabled musicians, let's say kind of chamber ensemble size, and they kind of will scaffold that ensemble of disabled musicians to make music, not with the main orchestra. They tend not to mix the two, but as a kind of separate project in its own right. The problem with that is that you maintain this two-tier system. You maintain this sense of a ghetto over there for some poor disabled musicians who are being given a little go, right? Para orchestra is only about the best and about the fact that when you come to see the band, you're not thinking about disability at all. You're there for the art. It has to be that.
I mean, that's the impression I got when I watched your videos of the para orchestra. I mean, I wasn't thinking about disabled or not at all. I felt that I was just watching a very exciting new project, whether you are playing some old music or like newly commissioned music. I mean, and you usually have very good visual presentation as well to go with the music. Could we talk about like maybe one of your key projects? I mean, of course, you said at the beginning it was formed around the time of the Paralympics when you performed with Coldplay. Was it? That's the kind of first outing of this para orchestra. Could we talk about some of the key projects that you think are really representative of the spirit of the para orchestra?
Something that I'm very proud of with para orchestra. Something the world in which we flourish as an orchestra, I suppose, is a world which again is fed by many different sources. So this is an orchestra that hand on heart can play the pants off Beethoven. My God, para orchestra play Beethoven well, but they also play Barry White really well. They also play the music of Surgeon's Girl really well. They can play Kraftwerk really well, but they can also play Mozart really well. Now already I'm describing something. If my words are to be believed, if I'm speaking truth, there's actually no other orchestra on the planet who can occupy all of those stylistic terrains with authenticity. You know, a great symphony orchestra, let's say in Vienna or Berlin or Dublin or Hong Kong, will play great Mahler, I'm sure, will play great Ligeti, I'm sure, hopefully they can, but they won't play Barry White very well. And they certainly won't play Surgeon's Girl's music very well, right? They occupy like the different stratospheres and there's no connecting tissue between them. Para orchestra does with alacrity and with great authenticity, with investment, with agency, occupy any number of different musical galaxies simultaneously. So yeah, I mean, I've already mentioned several there. I mean, you know, Trip the Light Fantastic was this piece. We just opened the major new concert hall, which has been rebuilt in Bristol, really exciting venue called Bristol Beacon, with a piece composed by Surgeon's Girl, who is an astonishing electronic musician, as it happens, based in Bristol. Her world is techno. Now, immediately thinking, oh God, orchestra and techno, that's going to be appalling, like Daddy at the Disco. Well, I hope I'm not being arrogant. I believe that a new, a new kind of like type of music sort of emerged in that moment, which was Ligeti as well as very beat-driven, was concrete, was micro sound, was many things, dub, but also impressionistic, also like, you know, nodding in the direction of Ravel and Debussy and Mussorgsky and Holst and Berio and Bernstein. Even Strauss at times, you know, worlds can come together and para orchestra does it better than anyone. So, I mean, yeah, perhaps your viewers would like to see a little bit of Trip the Light. It's pretty exciting.
What we're hoping to create here tonight is a kind of son et lumière of the most extreme sort. Of course, it's a celebration of the orchestra. It's a celebration of techno and the sweet spot between those two seemingly opposed worlds. And it's a visual feast. It involves extraordinary Surgeon's Girl, an electronic musician from Bristol, together with para orchestra, responding composer Oliver Vibrance, and the amazing Limbic Cinema, who are world leaders in projection mapping.
Well, working with large-scale projection mapped animation, and we've tried to tie this into the building and the architecture as much as possible. Obviously the redesign of the main hall is absolutely stunning, so we're trying to kind of bring that out in the visuals as much as possible, whilst also kind of creating a narrative which takes audiences out of darkness and into light.
To push new music in its context, in its way, it's what rendering classical music, and I think it's making a really exciting statement for this venue and for Bristol to be like doing it differently. We want to challenge audiences, we want to challenge the medium.
Could we talk a little bit about the actual side of, or your actual experience with working with people with different disability? You must have got a great team helping you to assist different musicians with the very different needs, because as you said, some disabilities are more invisible than others, and then we as an audience often don't really see what was going on behind the scene. But could you just share with us some of the technologies that might have helped you, or some of the measures that you have put in to help these disabled musicians?
I can't stress highly enough how Para Orchestra flourishes as an institution in no small way because of the phenomenal team of people that run it. I am beyond lucky to have working with me an astonishing group of producers and coordinators and kind of holistic. It's beyond belief. You see, the problem I have, I suppose, with the orchestral sector, and God knows I know it well enough, you know, it's been my obsession for 35 years. The orchestral sector has many great things about it. Of course, the music it plays, this perfect team, these are all things of wonder, marks the orchestral tradition out as very special indeed. But if I'm being honest with you, the orchestral sector is exceptionally brutal. Orchestral musicians are treated, they are pushed, the pressure they are under, the deadlines they have, the sheer volume of work they have to do. It's little surprise that alcoholism, drug abuse, mental health are endemic problems in the orchestral sector. People fall like flies. They can't cope anymore and they fall apart. And then what does the orchestral sector do? Broadly, just pushes them aside. Oh, there'll be someone else to replace that person. That person's burnt out, right? So in a way, they look down their noses. I'm being unfair. People are compassionate, but that is the way the industry works. Now with Para Orchestra, because we've got so many different people with different kinds of requirements, if you like, different kinds of disability, for want of a better word, of course we have to be much more person-centered. We have to take a kind of a cool look at every musician. And I'm talking about non-disabled musicians just as much as disabled musicians. Everyone is sort of, if you like, thought about and assessed. I mean, look, we don't always get it right, but I would like to think that we are very person-centered in a way that the orchestral sector tends not to be. It's just a group of people, like a workforce, bunch of slaves. Para Orchestra, hopefully, everyone feels that their needs are attended to. I'm sure we get it wrong some of the time, but I'd like to think in the greater part we get it right. Because, look, on the one hand, that's the right thing to do, right? That's just fair. But also, of course, from a more cynical point of view, we get better work out of people if we look after them better. I mean, it's such a basic thing. If you've got like all day rehearsal sessions, and so you're going to provide lunch in the middle of the day, if you provide like a half decent lunch, so your orchestra feel well nourished, they feel satisfied, you'll get a better afternoon of work out of them. So it's quite a no-brainer. If you use a wheelchair, or you have a hearing impairment, or you have a particular disability, if the stage setup has been carefully calibrated so that you feel really comfortable and able to play to your very best ability, then of course, lo and behold, you will play to your very best ability. So again, the Power Orchestra will get more bang for their buck. So it makes total sense to be individually person-centered rather than, the other. So that's really the fundamental secret to our success. We just want to scaffold people so they can sing their very highest, they can play their very most glorious, and lo and behold, they do.
Well, I see your projects are very diverse in terms of orchestration. I mean, we can get a bit more technical about this. So I'm just wondering, you must have got a pool of musicians, both disabled and non-disabled. Do you kind of just cater the new commissioned? I mean, how do you decide the orchestration of each new commission? And when a composer is commissioned by you to write a piece for the Power Orchestra, what kind of, if any, extra consideration do they have to take into when they write a work, they create a new work?
Okay, that's a really good question. Thank you for asking that question. I think I should talk a little bit about how we incubate new work. You're quite right that most of our projects involve brand new music, with new lead artists and new constellations. It's less usual for us to play existing music, although we do also play our Beethoven and our Mozart, unquestionably. The way we like to work is a bit different from the conventional model. You know the conventional model, you yourself as a composer know all too well that an orchestra will ring you up and say, we'd like a new piece from you, please. You'll have a brief discussion about what forces to use. Probably it's a standard orchestra. Then you'll go away for a few months, you'll write the piece, you'll present it to the orchestra will rehearse the piece, and then they'll premiere the piece. Now that's a time-honored pattern or model, right? Now at Power Orchestra, we tend to adopt a slightly different, more organic, more deep vein process, partly because we are more person-centered, and particularly because you can probably already tell of the 100 or so, 80, 90, 100 or so musicians that make up Power Orchestra, we're talking about people coming from a much wider and broader range of different musical backgrounds. It's not just the classical orchestral route. There are many coming from different points of the musical compass. So if you're going to hire a lead artist from outside, you're going to want to let them have a chance to acquaint themselves, not just with the instruments that are on offer. By the way, there are more various and diverse types of instruments available in a Power Orchestra setting than there are in a conventional orchestra setting for all the reasons I've laid out. But it's about that lead artist getting to know the personalities behind all those instruments. It's not just, I'm going to write for an oboe. It's like the lead artist can write for this particular oboist who's got this particular relationship both to their instrument and to the music they make, or indeed to the assistive technology that they have to use. So what we do is we create a sequence of R&Ds, research and development time, where we bring the lead artist or artists into a space with a kind of specimen selection, a kind of like cut down, a small subsection of the orchestra, so that the lead artists can effectively play with these musicians. That they can all, it's a bit like a kind of a workshop. It's a bit like throwing paint at the wall to see what interesting patterns you make. And so as a result of that, the lead artist really gets under the bonnet of individual musicians in Power Orchestra, what their parameters are, what they can offer. And that lead artist may then decide, actually, I don't like anything that player is doing. But there's enough about that player that makes them interesting, which means that then if the lead artist can work for long enough and have enough of these R&Ds with said musician, perhaps there'll be an accord. They'll find a way that actually something that musician now starts to do satisfies that lead artist. So it's like a virtuous circle. It's like a great echo loop, feedback loop. Do you see what I'm saying? So that So that once the lead artist has kind of been through this process with a fledgling group of the orchestra of several of these kind of workshop R&Ds, the piece is starting to kind of amplify, starting to take shape. And then not only is that when that piece is finally premiered, not only is it kind of like immensely satisfying from the point of view of the lead artist, I think, because they have really, they've tapped in at a kind of fundamental, almost soul level with those musicians and written music which resonates, where there's a kind of a resonance and a meeting point between the lead artist spirit and the musician spirit. Not only that, but those musicians that hit that stage to perform that piece have an agency and an investment with the music because they've been there since it was gestating. They were sort of there almost at the point of conception. They've been with that embryo as it's grown. And then as it bursts, it's already something that they know really well, that they are related to. So it sounds arrogant, but I do think that when you see Power Orchestra premiere a new piece, there is a depth of engagement, investment with that material, which you don't necessarily always see. Orchestras are a bit like sausage factories, right? They're pumping out so much product all of the time, including quite a lot of new music. You can't expect them to be very invested. They'll just play it as well as they can, what they see in front of them. But they won't have a kind of worldview about that music or a relationship to it. Not really. A relationship born out of what? 2 days of rehearsal. That's pretty skin deep. With our projects, you're talking about 9 months to a year of slow but steady gestation. So it's a really exciting model.
This kind of relationship actually sounds like a concerto soloist and the composer. You know, sometimes the composer would consult the soloist of a new concerto, and then, you know, he would feel invested and involved, as you said, from the beginning of the a creation process. But it is indeed really rare to have the whole orchestra feeling that they have been involved with the creative process from the beginning. So I think it's a two-way thing. It's good for the composer, and also it's good for the orchestra because they feel they are, you know, the piece is tailor-made for them. And so when you
absolutely, and that their kind of their limitations or their great strengths, their unusual strengths, have been identified by the lead artist and have sort of somehow become incorporated. And look, you know yourself as a composer, there's something a bit unfortunate about the conventional model where you write the piece, then the orchestra rehearse it in as short as possible time and then perform it, because the orchestra tend to then look at the composer as a point of hatred. It's like, you bloody composer, you've made me do all these things that I find really hard to do. Why'd you do that? I'm cross with you. I'm going to do my best, but I don't like you very much. That tends to be the dynamic. Poor composers, they get shot down in flames in these incredibly overly rushed, last minute throwing together of all the material. Again, with Power Orchestra, I don't think that happens because by the end of the process, that lead artist is really close to all those musicians. They've been through several fires. They've jumped over several sort of chasms together, and they've arrived at something that they're all mutually very, very committed to. So it's a kinder process as well as a much more satisfying one.
Well, thank you for understanding what we as composer have to encounter at orchestra.
Yeah, I hate it. I hate the animosity. It's basically because orchestras are full of anxious people. I mean, anxiety levels are always at peak in an orchestra. I don't think you ever walk into an orchestra and there isn't a huge mirage of anxiety right across the room. Everyone is terrified about dropping a stitch, looking like an idiot, making a fool of themselves. So if they're playing material which is unfamiliar to them and which makes challenges of them technically, immediately they're furious and they want someone to suffer.
You know, I still remember the piece that I wrote for you and the BBC Concert Orchestra. There was one moment where I felt, okay, maybe I've done something okay, right? Because
one moment.
Whoa.
Oh man, you wrote a really good piece.
At one point, I saw the brass players putting away their newspaper and looking at the. There was a very nice moment. Something
that was victory.
Yeah, and also in my case, it was just an orchestral piece, but actually I wrote a fairly substantial solo for saxophone solo, soprano saxophone, and because I knew it was for Simon Haram, So, you know,
Yeah, well,
that's kind of what you meant
amazing.
by knowing the performer and then, you know, kind of tailor-made some music for a person, you know, for a person. And I think that was one of the high points of that commission. It is because of that connection between the creator and the, you know, the orchestra that you write for. So I think that is a very interesting and very important and actually very important, you know, creative way of working with commissions. Could I just,
Thank you.
you know, when you're commissioned musician, they're not all only identified as composer. I guess they work quite differently because some of the pieces will be kind of fully notated, or do they mostly involve some sort of, you know, semi-improvisation in the music? Because from what I heard online or from your video, it felt like they're usually a mixture of notated and some kind of improvised moments. Would you say that's kind of the usual case?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'd say the honest truth is there isn't really a pattern or a rule, and that each project has slightly different parameters. Seeing as we were talking about Trip Like Fantastic, so you've got the lead artist, Surgeon's Girl, Sinead McMillan. She wrote the entire piece, right, and then put it into this kind of like deep laboratory process, bit by bit, through R&Ding with larger sections of the orchestra, and then with individual members of the orchestra to kind of try and get further on the journey, to find a point of accord, to find a way that her creative spirit and this person's creative spirit could actually meet and spark in a positive way. Then you've got, alongside Sinead, you've got what we call the responding composer, who's a very dear member, a very, very phenomenal member of the Power Orchestra family, called Oliver Vibrant, a very gifted composer as well. And he worked, as I say, as a responding composer. So he would take Sinead's material, Surgeon's Girl's material, and, if you like, sort of like take it into the orchestral realm. So notate it, yes, orchestrate it out, but also, to some extent anyway, develop it, certainly sonically, and then pass it back to Sinead, who would then perhaps comment upon it, work on it herself, parcel it back. So again, you've got a kind of virtuous circle kind of scenario in play. So what you're talking about with that piece is basically it's notated. Once all the decisions and everyone was happy, it did get written down, although Sinead ain't working on music. She's playing her machines completely, you know, from memory. That's the kind of person she is. I definitely had a score. But it's about, yes, notated, but there are still large patches of certain openness. I mean, Seb Rochford plays the drum part, and there are large portions of the piece where he ain't playing to a part. He's playing to a kind of an agreement, an agreed vibe, a direction of travel that Sinead and he have worked on very hard to find. So it's a mixture of freedom and a certain amount of security. I mean, orchestral musicians do, given a choice, prefer to have some kind of roadmap. So we tend to provide that. But then there'll be other cases where we'll do an entire project off book, where the orchestra will play for over an hour with no music anywhere in the room. And they've learned it all. And there'll be open passages as well as very fixed passages. It just depends what we're doing.
Okay, so I've got a slightly related question, because a lot of these pieces were tailor-made for the orchestra. How do the creators feel about other performance opportunity, like by other orchestras? Are they concerned that because it is so tailor-made for your orchestra that it may not get performances by other orchestras, or do they look to kind of, you know, I mean, as a composer, you often think about other performances by the commissioning body. So I'm just wondering, when they do that, do they plan to like create a different version that might be able to be performed by other ensembles, or are they quite happy for the work to be, you know, totally made for you? Maybe that's a question for them, not for you.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to tell you that every lead artist and composer we worked with writes a piece for us, which then they can get played by 50 other orchestras. But unfortunately, I don't think that's true, because Power Orchestra is such an unusual mixture of things. Not just the instruments being unusual, but also the human beings playing the instruments. It's just a very different vibe from a conventional orchestra. So maybe it's a bit like if you wrote songs for ABBA. Let's say, I mean, I know Bjorn and Benny wrote all of ABBA's songs, but let's say you were drafted in from outside to write a song for ABBA. I don't think you'd necessarily expect that song would also be sung by Bucks Fizz and, I don't know, the Shangri-Las. Probably not. probably that song would only ever be performed by ABBA. I mean, maybe someone would do a cover of it down the line, but that's a different issue. It's like you can't really write a piece which then becomes an on-the-shelf piece that other people might use. I mean, look, never say never. Maybe it's possible. Maybe somebody's written for something for us, which has then gone on to be played by someone else. That would be wonderful. I'd love to see that happen, but I'd say it's unlikely.
Yeah, I mean, the orchestration is so unique. So it's kind of more like you're writing a song for a specific rock band or post-rock band, that kind of setting in my mind. So
I think that's right. And you know what? It's also, if I'm honest, it's hard to imagine the intensity being recreated. I mean, Trip the Light Fantastic is definitely a piece that on some level could be played by other orchestras with a lot of kind of homework done and study of the original practices involved. But I'm not sure, I'm being arrogant, but I'm not sure it would ever achieve the degree of white hot intensity that it achieves when Celtic Sky and Power Orchestra play that piece. There's an intensity, there's a kind of like it's almost like a transubstantial, it's like a transcendent, it's like a kind of an immolation. It's like a kind, I don't know, it's a sonic boom. It's something which you can't quite put into words, but I can't quite see how that would just be reconstituted out of nowhere by another group of people, because this group of people are so invested in this thing.
Yeah, that's
it very
process. So that, yeah. Could we maybe, let's talk about the future. I mean, what's your plan for para orchestras? What are you cooking up, and what's your, I mean, are you hoping to kind of keep creating more new projects and maybe expand it to other countries even?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. When I first started Para Orchestra, I actually called it the British Para Orchestra, because in my little fantasy, very quickly, other countries, the artistic communities in other countries go, oh, that's a good idea. Let's get one of those going in our country. I thought there'd be a Swedish Para Orchestra and a Japanese Para Orchestra. Look, I'm not making any criticism of anybody. These things are really hard to do. A lot of the musicians, well, I'll give you a bald example. The first iteration of Para Orchestra was about 20 musicians in the original ensemble, that group that played at the Paralympic Games. Of those 20 musicians, I think probably 2/3 had never made music with another human being before they joined Para Orchestra, because they had only been making music in their bedroom at home, in isolation and in privacy, in secret almost. It was quite hard to find them. You know, these are not people who by and large are coming through the conventional channels, or at least that was the case. It continues to be, to some extent, the case. Whenever we do a call out for the next tranche of musicians with disability who want to audition for Para Orchestra, we do it about every 18 months, 2 years. We want to see who else is out there. Now, I'm very happy to say each time we do a call out, we get more applications. I think we did one 18 months, 2 years ago, where we had maybe 40 applications. We've just done one now, and we have well over 100 applications. So gradually, more people are emerging from the woodwork, although interestingly, a large proportion of those musicians are actually ones who've been through the more conventional music school conservatoire route. They're musicians with disabilities, but until now, they've hidden their disability, because the industry is still so not just deaf to disability, but kind of antagonistic towards it, if I'm being brutally honest. It's like, for all the reasons I mentioned much earlier, an orchestra will think very hard before they hire a visually impaired musician, because their whole schedule, the places they play, the kind of music they create, the way they work, isn't calibrated to include someone who can't see, right? That requires a whole different kind of like thought process and range of facilities, which that orchestra, for whatever reason, doesn't have the just doesn't have the capacity to deliver on. So of course, that visually impaired musician will get pushed to the back of the queue. That's the problem. So, you know, finding musicians with disability who are even prepared to talk about their disability, because it's such a taboo in the industry, is an ongoing story.
Okay,
sorry, just to find time, I realize I didn't quite answer your question. I would love to think that nascent Para Orchestras would start springing up in other countries. And look, I think there are green shoots. There are signs of more orchestras in more countries, at least acknowledging the very great and urgent need to platform musicians with disability, the extent to which they have the imagination to actually incorporate said musicians into their main area of work, their main orchestra, that's still, should we say, a work in progress. There's so much to be done. I don't think this problem is going to begin to be resolved in my lifetime. It's going to take a lot longer than that, because from grassroots up, we need to rethink. I mean, look, let's just remember something on the upside, very little known fact. Thanks to technology, as it currently, the state it's evolved to at this point in time, actually for the first moment in the history of humankind, there is now no longer any barrier to any human being who wants to make music, however they happen to be made, whatever kind of disability or lack of disability they may have. There is a musical interface for every human being. Now, that has never been true before in the history of our species. So that in itself is worthy of celebration. The next thing we need to do is make sure people know it's out there, and that, more to the point, that there are people who can help scaffold someone who is new to a technology to help them evolve and flourish with that technology. That's work in progress. But everything is out there. The opportunities, at least for a musician or someone who wants to be a musician to engage with an instrument, there is an instrument for everyone now.
Well, just now you mentioned the advance of technology helping like musicians of different disabilities. Just back to your team of amazing people helping you with the Para Orchestra. Do you also have like software engineers, people like that, to help you to develop platforms for different disabilities? So like tailor-made certain.
Yes, we do. Yes, we do. We've got all sorts of amazing people with technical, acute technical knowledge and virtuosity, actually, working with stuff that exists, helping to develop and streamline stuff that already exists to make it work better, just to make better instruments. In fact, we've gone so far as that we actually do a project as part of our Modulate. Modulate is a whole area of our work at Para Orchestra, which is about helping the musicians who are already in the orchestra to develop their own personal creative practice. The truth about being an orchestral musician is you enter the industry, you work phenomenally hard on your one instrument, playing in that section of the orchestra for many years until eventually you burn out and you retire or whatever. You don't get a chance to kind of think bigger thoughts, to kind of develop your creative practice, to develop your imagination. So this whole sort of column of Para Orchestra work is called Modulate, is about creating opportunities for our musicians to think those bigger thoughts. And one part of it is we've recently done a project called Tech and Play, which is about showcasing some of the assistive technology instruments which currently exist, but inviting any musician to have a go on them, any musician to develop skills with that instrument. The point is, yes, these instruments have been invented to facilitate musicians with a particular kind of disability, to create a possibility for them to make music. This instrument is calibrated to work within their disability. But that's not to say that instrument can't be used by other people. It's like saying a Hammond organ should only really be played by black gospel musicians in Albuquerque. Well, don't get me wrong, they should be at the front of the queue because they're the greatest Hammond organ players in the world. But that would be absurd, wouldn't it, to say, well, no one else should play those instruments because it's just for those musicians. In the same way, a clarion or Mimo gloves or any number of more interesting instruments, actually, which are assistive technology instruments, they're great instruments in themselves, potentially. So actually, as such, can be played by anyone, not just by the people who happen to have the disability for which they were designed.
Actually, this is very interesting. I didn't know this side of your project. Like, it is really refreshing for actually orchestral musicians to take part in something of more personal and more creative. Because as you said, a lot of them got into orchestras with all their techniques and musicianships, but then they throughout the year quite easy for them to lose touch with creativity and become more like a worker of other people's music. So I think it's very lovely that you have got this side of the projects.
Yeah, it's exciting, I think, and of course, by extension, it creates yet more variety and possibility for any composer or lead artist walking into the room, because there is an almost limitless number of different sonic worlds that can be inhabited and explored, because the range of instruments is almost infinite.
So finally, if we were to kind of create a Hong Kong para orchestra, what kind of advice would you give us?
Look, firstly, I would almost die with pleasure if Hong Kong formed a para orchestra. That would be amazing. I don't think I have much advice to offer other than, what ingredients do you need to embark on such an adventure? I think they're quite simple ingredients. They are passion, optimism, and patience. Passion, of course, passion has to be the catalyst for any project worth its salt. Optimism, in that there are so many barriers. There are so many blocks in the road. There are so many reasons not to proceed with such a scheme because there are so many challenges. But patience, because these things don't happen overnight. Para orchestra is only starting to get into its stride now. I started it in 2012. And we've been incredibly lucky for all sorts of reasons. The stars have been in alignment for us. I mean, it's so important to keep persisting, though, and to keep the one central focus, which is about the art, not simply about facilitating some enjoyable therapy for some people who want to make music. It's got to be more than that. I mean, don't get me wrong, that's important too. And many, many people do amazing work in terms of music as a therapy. Don't for a minute think I'm discounting that. But in terms of what we're doing here, what para orchestras are, they only flourish if the work is of the highest value.
Well, thank you very much, Charles, for your sharing today. It has been wonderful to talk to you, and it is very, very inspiring knowing what you have done and what, how you came up with the idea and how to develop this para orchestra. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your future projects.
Thank you. It's been great talking to you. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you.